Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and Sohorayim Tovim, which means good afternoon. If you ever wondered how to say good afternoon, Sohorayim Tovim. So we say Laila Tov before we go to bed. We say Boker Tov when we get up in the morning, and we say Sohorayim Tovim when it is good afternoon. So thank you so much for joining me for our Shabbat Chaverim. And I have what I think is an interesting part of our Torah narrative to share with you today. So this morning at services, I mentioned that this particular Shabbat is a double portion. Matot Maseh. And there's so much in here that it is very hard to focus on any one or even two parts of the Torah portion because there's so much written about it, so much interpretation, so much commentary, and so on. But just to kind of tell you where we are in our story, the Israelites are done with their journeying. We are at the very end of the book of Numbers. And this has been a time of trial and tribulation where the Israelites are really trying to grow up a little bit, trying to understand what it means to be a nation, what it means to have laws, what it means to follow commandments, what it means to have leadership from somebody, and how to address that leadership, which is going to become very critical in what I'm going to talk about today. And also what they're going to begin to encounter and expect once they enter the land, because they're about to leave the meanderings in the desert, cross the Jordan River, and go into the Promised Land. So, in the book of Numbers, we have two accounts, one of which took place in the Torah portion last week, and one of which takes place at the end of the book of Numbers this week. And that is, we are introduced to 5 young ladies who are known as the daughters of Zelophehad. Now, what's interesting is that in much of the Torah, when we are introduced to female characters, be they older, younger, somewhere in between, we get very little information about them. In fact, we don't even get their names most of the time. What we get is, sorry about that, I just got some kind of a message on my computer, which I just shut off. And we don't get names, we don't know ages, we don't really get birth orders, we don't know status, and that sort of thing. Not the case with these 5 girls. They are known as the daughters of Zelophehad, Benot Zelophehad, but we do get their names. And the 5 sisters are Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they lived at the end of the Israelites' exodus from Egypt as they prepared to enter the Promised Land. And they raised before the Israelite community a case of women's rights and obligations related to inheriting property in the absence of a male heir in the family. So Zelophehad itself is a very strange name because the translation is dark shadow. So when I hear of dark shadow, I think of that 70s or 80s soap opera about the vampires. And everybody loved it and was addicted to it. I never got into it, but it means dark shadow, which kind of implies that this man who was their father We don't learn anything about him other than he died. We don't know how. We don't know where their mother is. We don't know what the circumstances of his death are, although the rabbis have a lot to say about that because the ancient rabbis had a lot to say about a lot of things. So anyway, he was part of the tribe of Manasseh, and Manasseh was, just to tell you, just to give you some ideas to where they fit into the story. Joseph married an Egyptian woman. She had 2 children with him, 2 boys, Ephraim and Manasseh. They were half Israelite and half Egyptian, because Joseph was an Israelite, really, and and his wife was an Egyptian. And when Jacob, Joseph's father, died, the last of our 3 patriarchs, he gave to Manasseh and Ephraim each a half portion of what their tribe inherited. So the 11 tribes all inherited a full portion. Joseph's 2 sons, Jacob's grandsons, inherited a half portion each. This man, Zelophehad, was a man of that tribe. Okay, so the biblical account tells us that he died during the 40 years when the Israelites were wandering in the wilderness. And it says explicitly that he didn't play any part in the rebellion that we read about a couple of weeks ago with Korach, who rebelled against Moses and Aaron by standing up and saying, why do you guys have this special relationship with God? And of course, Korach and all his followers were punished. They were sucked into the earth and swallowed up. The Torah portion makes it clear that Zelophehad did not die as a result of this Korach rebellion. But we don't really know why he died. There are some other thoughts which I can share with you later. So Zelophehad has no sons. He has 5 daughters. And they go to Moses, and they go to Eleazar the priest, who is Aaron's son, and so he is now the high priest. And they go to the chieftains, who are kind of the heads of each of the tribes, and they go to the whole assembly, meaning the entire community of Israel at that time, which of course was hundreds of thousands of people. We know from last week's Torah portion that there was another census that was done because they're about to go into the land, and you want to know how many men of fighting age you have before you go into the land. And so we know that there were at least 620,000 men. So these daughters go before this whole assembly. And we're reading about this in Numbers 16, in chapter 16. And it does not in any case cite the tribe of Manasseh or this guy Zelophehad being involved in the rebellion. So the daughters go to Moses, and they stand at the entrance to the tent of meeting. And Moses is sitting there, and as he has become accustomed to doing, he is hearing these cases from people day and night. And they go to him and they say, look, our father died. He was not part of Korach's rebellion. He died in his own sin. Now, there is some question as to what that means. And earlier in the book of Numbers, we hear of the case of a man who is out on the Sabbath collecting firewood. And he is struck down and killed because the Torah specifically says, do not gather wood on Shabbat. You know, if you need wood for kindling to have a flame and light during Shabbat, you better do it before Shabbat. he didn't. And so he was punished and he was struck down. That's one of the theories. So he died because of his own sin. He didn't bring other people with him. And the daughters go to Moses and they say, look, he had no sons. There's only us 5 girls. Why should we not inherit his stuff? His land, his cattle, his flocks, his servants, whatever was his. He has no sons. We should get them. Now, in those days, of course, the inheritors were the men. And in general, if somebody had a brother when he died and no sons, the other males in the family would inherit the father's wealth. So the question is, where does that leave these poor 5 girls? So I want to give some context to who these women might have been. Biblical women got married very young, as soon as they reached puberty and were able to bear children. And so it is likely that these 5 daughters were kids because they weren't married yet. If they had questions with regard to property rights and they were married, that already would have been resolved. We would have known who got their father's property, namely their husbands. But that wasn't the case. They were not married. And we're going to learn about that more. And so in those days, when a woman got married, her husband inherited her portion of the father's inheritance if the father was no longer alive and there were no sons and there were no uncles. So the daughter said, he died, and if we don't inherit this stuff, it's not going to stay with the mishpacha. It's not going to stay in the family. So, how often have we heard of this in modern days? I think of, maybe kind of a funny situation, but, people always say, if you want your kids to inherit your stuff, give it to them now. Don't wait until after you're gone. Because unless you give it to them now or you specify what you want them to have, guess who's going to get it? The second wife. So, they were concerned that their father's stuff was not going to go to them, but was going to go to strangers, possibly from another tribe, because women and men were allowed to marry amongst the tribes. They could marry somebody from their own clan, or they could marry somebody from another tribe. So they go to Moses and they plead their case and realize that these girls were young. So, maybe they were between the ages of 8 and 14 or 15, something like that, because none of them were married yet. And if they had reached the age of maturation, they would already be married. So it had to have taken a lot of chutzpah for these young girls to go to Moses, stand in front of the entire community of Israel, and plead their case. Okay. So Moses takes the case to God. This is a biggie. This is not like traffic court. This is going all the way to the Supreme Being court. And God told Moses that the plea of Zelophehad's daughters was just. That yes, they were right. And they should be granted their father's hereditary holdings. Okay. So that's what we hear about in Numbers 16. In Numbers 27, which is part of the Torah portion that we read this morning, the heads of the clan of Manasseh's grandson. So Manasseh, Joseph's son, Jacob's grandson, He himself has a grandson whose name is Gilad, or Gilead, as we would say. And the heads of Gilead's clan, they come to Moses and they appeal. I'm not going to say appeal again, because this is what we're going to discuss. They appeal to Moses and the chieftains. And here's the argument they make. They say, look, if these daughters who are free to marry men from other clans, other tribes, marry somebody outside of the tribe of Manasseh, then the share that that daughter has is now ultimately going to become property of the tribe into which she marries. It'll still be hers, but now anything that's accumulated becomes property of that tribe. So when she has children, she is not independently free to bequeath that from her father to her children or her grandchildren. It now becomes part of whatever tribe she goes to. And they said, look, it's going to be property that's lost to the tribe of Manasseh. And it's going to become a portion of the tribe into which she marries. So Moses says, you got a point there. And he goes to God, and God instructs Moses to tell the daughters, and actually the daughters haven't pled this case. This plea comes from the elders of the tribe of Manasseh and the leaders, that Zelophehad's daughters can marry anybody they want, but only among the men of the tribe of Manasseh. If they marry out of the tribe, even though it's an Israelite tribe, then they lose the property. And the actual verbiage from the Torah says, and Moses commanded the children of Israel according to the word of the Lord, saying, the tribe of the sons of Joseph, because Joseph was the patriarch from whom this tribe came, is saying the right thing. This is the thing which the Lord commanded concerning the daughters of Zelophehad, saying, let them be married to whom they think best. Wow, that's a pretty outrageous idea, that these women could marry who they wanted. Only into the family of the tribe of their father shall they be married. So shall no inheritance of the children of Israel remove from tribe to tribe. For the children of Israel shall cleave, every one of them, to the inheritance of the tribe of his fathers, and every daughter that has an inheritance in any tribe of the children of Israel. So this is not going to just go for Manasseh, the tribe of Manasseh. This is going to go for any tribe. Shall be wife unto one of the family of the tribe of her father, so that the children of Israel may keep those inheritances within their tribes. No inheritance should move from one tribe to another. And so God commanded it, and Moses followed through and told the leaders of the various the chieftains of the tribe of Gilead, don't worry about it. They can marry whoever they want, but they got to marry within the tribe. And if they leave the tribe and marry somebody from Reuven or Gad or Dan or Levi or one of the other tribes, they lose the inheritance. It goes with it has to remain with Manasseh. So for Machlah, Tirzah, and Hoglah, and Milcah, and Noah, the daughters of Zelophehad, they were all married unto their fathers, brothers, sons. So we do find out that evidently Zelophehad had brothers. So they had uncles, and they were married to the sons of their uncles. And who are the sons of their uncles? Their cousins. So we're learning a little bit about marriage within the Jewish clans. They're going to marry their uncle's sons. In other words, their cousins. I need a sip of water because that's a little overwhelming. Okay, so now I want to get into some of the nitty gritty here. Some of the biblical commentary. In the Talmud and in the Zohar, the reference to Zelophehad having died in his own sin is used to equate him with the man that was executed for gathering the sticks on the Sabbath, which I mentioned earlier. But there are other commentaries that say, we really don't know. We don't know who he was. In the Talmud, Rabbi Joshua interpreted that they first petitioned the assembly. In other words, the girls went to the assembly first, and then the chieftains came later on, and then Eleazar, and then finally Moses. But there was another rabbi that said that Zelophehad's daughters didn't do it in that order, that they actually came in front of all of them because they were all sitting together, and that they drew near to Moses in the presence of Eleazar, who was the high priest then, and all of the chieftains, because they were afraid of Moses' anger at Zelophehad, at their father, and thought that it might be that if Moses was in a public forum, his anger might not bubble up. And although we've seen Moses get angry when there's lots of people around, so I don't know if that's very valid, why that would be the case. But, sometimes people behave better when they're in public and they're confronted than if you get them in private. And Moses is sitting there with the chieftains and all the people of Israel, and Moses is sitting there with Eleazar, his nephew, the son of Aaron, who has died, and he's now the high priest, and they're figuring, we got an edge here because he's not going to blow up at us and say, you silly girls, go away. He may listen to what we have to say. So according to the Zohar, Moses presented the case to God instead of deciding it himself out of a sense of modesty. Now, I don't know if that modesty means that he was a little bit flustered in front of 5 girls, or if that meant that he wanted to take himself down a notch by not giving himself the ultimate power to decide this very important question. So there's also an older rabbinic teaching that taught that Zelophehad's daughters were wise, that they were Torah students, and that they were righteous. And that there's another one that says that they were equal in merit, and that is why the order of their names varies in the text, because actually we don't know who was oldest, who was youngest, and who was in between. The reason being that when their names are mentioned in number 16, they're mentioned in one order, and then when they're mentioned in Numbers 27, it's a different order. And normally you would expect that children would be named in the order of age, starting with the eldest first and working down with the youngest. But that wasn't the case. And so one of the rabbinic teachings says, they were wise, they were Torah students, they were righteous, and nobody had any seniority over another because they were all equal. And according to the discussion from the Talmud, it says that they demonstrated their wisdom by raising their case in a timely fashion, just as Moses was talking about the law of Levirate marriage, which is called Yibum. And they argued that their rights to inherit by using an analogy to the Levirate marriage law, which I'll talk to you about in just 1 second, made it analogous to this law. And the daughters also demonstrated their righteousness ultimate by, marrying men who were fitting for them. They married men within the tribe of Manasseh. So a little bit about Levirate marriage. Levirate marriage states that in the event that a woman is married and has not yet borne children by her husband, that she is obligated to marry her brother-in-law. Now, she may have several brothers-in-law. Her husband may have a number of brothers, some of whom may be married already, but she is obligated to marry the brother of her husband, so that when she has children by this new husband, particularly sons, they will continue to be inheritors of the daughter. In other words, the wife can't inherit her deceased husband's property. It has to go to a male. So these 5 girls are pretty, they're pretty smart. They hear about this law of the Levirate marriage because Moses had just been expounding upon it and explaining it. And they say, time for us to figure out what happens if you're not married and your father dies. What happens to that property? So keeping in mind that these were young girls, because none of them were married yet, and they certainly would have been married if they were older, keeping in mind that their father died, but he wasn't part of this great sin of Korach, keeping in mind that we really don't know what his sin was, we want to know where this story is going. And you would think, with 2 narratives here, one which appears in the 16th chapter of the book of Numbers, and one which appears in the 27th chapter of the book of Numbers, that was necessarily the order in which they happened. In other words, would it make sense for the girls to go to Moses first and say, hey, our dad's dead. We want to inherit his property. He had no sons. Yeah, he's got brothers, but, we want his stuff. And then for the chieftains of the tribe of Gilead to come back and say, whoa, wait a minute. They can marry whoever they want, and if they marry somebody from another tribe, their stuff's going to go there. Or maybe it is hafuch. Hafuch. Hafuch means upside down or reversed. When you order in Israel, when you order a cafe hafuch, an upside down coffee, it means that the milk goes in first and the coffee is poured in on top of that. That's a hafuch. So is it the case where the chieftains of the tribes first come to Moses and say, we see a problem about to happen here. You have just talked to us about this Levirate marriage thing, where a woman whose husband dies has to marry her brother-in-law so that all of the property remains within the tribe. What do we do about women who aren't married whose father dies? We don't want them to be able to marry whoever they want because guess what? Their stuff is going to go away from our tribe. Now, these chieftains of the tribe of Gilead, which is part of Manasseh, knew about these 5 daughters, knew that this could be a problem. So did they actually go to Moses first, trying to preempt the daughters from coming and pleading their case? And if so, what proof do we have either way? So now we get into the whole area of literary criticism. How the Torah was written, how the Bible was written, who wrote the Bible, who wrote the Torah, how much we want to believe that the Torah is absolutely the Word of God, written by the hand of God, or spoken by the words of God, right into the hand of Moses on Mount Sinai, came down to the people just as God spoke it? Or do we look at the Torah in a different way? As a book of narratives that were stitched together by a bunch of different authors and editors who had varying agendas about what they wanted to have as written law. So I'm not taking a position either way. But I think that an argument could be made that maybe this story about Zelophehad's daughters didn't necessarily happen in the order in which it appears in the Torah. And we know that's the case for other stories too, because there are a few examples of stories that are very repetitious in nature, and through literary criticism, critique, through literary scholarship, we've been able to determine that maybe these similar stories didn't exactly happen in the order in which they appear in the Torah, but they were edited in that way to leave us with a lasting impression. So if the daughters went to Moses first and said, our dad has died, we want to inherit his stuff, and then later on, the chieftains of the tribe went to Moses and said, hey, they can marry whoever they want, but if they marry out of the tribe, we lose the property. We want them to be able to choose who they marry, but if they marry out of the tribe, the property remains with us. And given that that is in the very last part of the book of Numbers, it's what we remember. We always remember the final decision that was made, right? So when attorneys go to court and they argue a case, whether it is in civil court or criminal court or the Supreme Court, they are bringing up case law. They are bringing up cases from the past, like a proof text to prove their case. So the last thing that we read is that Moses goes back to God and comes back with the decision that if they want to keep the property, they have to stay in the tribe of Manasseh, and they can't marry outside of the tribe. And that's kind of the final word. However, we really don't know if that is absolutely the order in which this narrative came to be, the two narratives. Because it makes just as much sense that the chieftains of Gilead came to Moses because they saw a problem brewing. And they saw these 5 girls without brothers and without a father who, might create a little bit of conflict by saying, we should inherit this stuff. And so in order to nip that in the bud, did they come to Moses first and say, we don't want them to be able to inherit the property and then go join another tribe through marriage? And then the girls, having heard this determination, then go to Moses and say, it ain't fair, Moses. This decision that was made just is not just. It's not fair. We should be able to inherit. So the point that I'm trying to make through this very lengthy discussion is that we need to be aware of the way in which the narratives appear in the Torah. Because just like any book, editors came along and stitched these stories together and said, hey, this would be a good place to put this one. And this one is hanging out here somewhere. and we really don't know where to put it. So let's put it here because it makes more sense here than anywhere else. And right off the bat, I can name two of those stories for you. One is the Tower of Babel, which is just kind of stuck in a place where it doesn't make sense to what has happened before or what comes after. And the other is the story of Balak and Bilam, which we read a couple weeks ago. Balak, who is the Moabite king, who sends his prophet Bilam to go curse the people. And that is also a story that's just kind of stuck into the middle of the rest of the biblical narrative, the Torah narrative, without really making much sense to what came before or after. Now, the rabbis make sense of it because they will do backflips, cartwheels, and go through all kinds of machinations in order to make the stories work in that order. But I think you can see with the story about Zelophehad's daughters, or the daughters of Zelophehad, that it could have happened either way. Either they went to Moses first, and then the chieftains came and complained, or the chieftains saw a problem brewing, wanted to nip it in the bud, went to talk to Moses, and then the girls heard about the determination and they pled their case to Moses. The way it's in the Torah, the final determination is the first way, that the girls came first, the men came next, and it was determined that they had to marry within their tribe. So, it's a very interesting set of stories because it talks about, in ancient terms, rights of women to own property, and that there is some precedence for this. So we get, in scholarship, there are actually two different genealogies for Zelophehad in the Bible, because in Chronicles, which is at the very, very end of the Hebrew Bible, he is listed as a son of Manasseh. But in other places where his genealogy is mentioned, he's listed as a son of Hefer, who was the son of Gilead. Now, if he was actually a son of Manasseh, who was a grandson of Jacob, the son of Joseph, then he would have had more yichus. You know what yichus is? That means his genealogy would have been more important. Because if he were actually the son of Gilead, he would have been farther removed from Joseph. You know, the closer we are to the patriarchs, the more pure our blood is, so to speak. So both of these genealogies, though, record Zelophehad as being a member of the tribe of Manasseh. But there are some minor differences, some contradictions, by naming him as a descendant rather than as the second son of, and so on. According to another scholar, Zelophehad and his daughters are a fiction. This didn't really happen. And there are those out there who would say, what do you mean it didn't happen? It's in the Torah. It must have happened. But there is a scholar by the name of Shammai Feldman who says that, and he's not the only one, who says that Zelophehad and his daughters are really a fiction created to illustrate some of the legal rules of inheritance. And a lot of Jewish textual scholars regard these accounts concerning the daughters as ways of explaining how certain laws came to be. So the presence of Zelophehad and his daughters earlier on in Numbers 16, where we get that whole census where everybody's counted, is considered by some to be dubious in its authority. And there are others who make the connection of Tevia's 5 daughters in Fiddler on the Roof to the 5 daughters of Zelophehad. And because, you could presumably read the story very much in a similar way. Tevia's 5 daughters, even though Tevia is still alive, they are very headstrong young women. None of them married at the beginning of the story of Fiddler, and yet each one marries and goes off on her own. One marries a Russian, and one marries a simple tailor, and one marries somebody out of the tribe. And so the number 5 daughters, to be exact, 5 dowries, is a common trope that we're reading about here. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about the etymology of the names. I'm not going to get into the name Zelophehad because there's significant discussion among scholars as to where this name came from. It's not like your regular Tom, Dick, or Harry name in the Bible. By the way, you will notice that until we get to later parts of the Bible in the historical books, we don't have any name duplications in the Torah. The individuals have their own names. There isn't like Moses Jr. or another Moses later on. So the names are all individual, and we see later on in the Bible another Tamar. There are some duplications of names, but not initially. When we get through the Torah, we don't have anybody who has the identical name as a predecessor. So there's no juniors, and there's no confusion as to which Noah we're talking about, because there's only one Noah. So there's discussion about, what Zelophehad's name means, what it comes from. Some say it was from Syriac. Others say that it is derived from a Hebrew term, Zalpachad, which means shadow from terror. And, a lot of scholars have different interpretations of the name. But with regard to the names of the daughters, scholars largely are in agreement about what those names mean. Machla means forgiven. Noah means movement. Milka means queen, like Malka. Tirza means pleasing. And Hogla means circle, dancing. Though for this reason, it's also associated with the Hebrew word for partridge. And I don't know specifically if partridges are known for going in circles or something like that. But anyway, those are the names. Legal advice concerning inheritance rights and obligations of the daughters is, as I mentioned, given twice in this biblical account. So the first time we read it, when there's no men around, no brothers around, they get it. But on the second occasion, Levirate marriage, this marriage of the brother-in-law, and the property having to stay within the clan, takes precedence. And the girls are told, of course, that they have to marry someone within the clan, within the tribe, if they want to keep the goods. So, this brings about a question of the laws of inheritance in general. The biblical text states that Moses, of course, goes to God to rule on the issue, and rather than deciding it himself, because he was modest. Moses is characterized always as very humble and modest, and that he's told by God that, a little conflict between Snickers and Hershey over there. Sorry about that. Shabbat Shalom, kids. Shabbat Shalom. No fighting. Got a little too close to his bed. So, God is very, understands Moses's modesty and humility and says that, if there are no sons, the daughter should be considered. And if there are no children at all, the inheritance passes on to the brothers. So had Zelophehad died without children, doesn't say if he'd been married. We know if he'd been married, his wife would have to marry one of the brothers. If he hadn't been married and had no children, because men still had property, inheritance, and so on, that would have gone to his brothers. And if there are no brothers, who does it go to? The nearest relative in his clan. What if that nearest relative is his mother? What if that nearest relative is his sister? What if that nearest relative, well, it couldn't be a female cousin, because then it would go to his uncle. But it's just very interesting to see. And Maimonides, among other commentators, extrapolated this into the conclusion that if they exist, then sons and their descendants are the heirs of an individual. But if they do not, if they don't have sons, it would be any daughters or their descendants. And if these don't exist, no daughters or descendants, then it's going to be, if a man dies and his father is still alive, then his father will inherit. So there are all kinds of extrapolations about this how this happens. Whoa, that scared me. Snickers, be sweet to Hershey. He's your older brother. Be sweet to him. I have to speak to my dogs like toddlers sometimes because they misbehave. So evidently the regulations that preferred male descendants may have come to be disregarded in some respects because for example, in the book of Job, which scholars date to about the 4th century, it states in the epilogue of the book of Job that his daughters were given equal inheritance rights to his sons. And the Karaites, who we studied about in Chayver with Rabbi Leah, who were Torah true Jews, always gave daughters the same rights as sons. And by the Middle Ages, it came to be a tradition to evade the inequality between daughters and sons via some kind of, legal made-up thing in which the father claims that he's indebted to his daughter for a certain sum of money and that this debt is due him by his heirs, and it probably has to do with dowries and that sort of thing, and then makes a formal agreement that debt is paid when he dies, either in cash or as a proportion of his estate. So by that mechanism, the daughter would gain a share in her father's estate, or a sum of money equal to the value of whatever that share was. So if it was 15 cows and 100 sheep and goats, but she didn't get those things, sometimes when you're living in the suburbs, it's not easy to have those kinds of things, and so you get the money instead. So very interesting to look at all these different machinations of how the law was put into effect. Later in the book of Numbers, of course, when I read what I talked to you about, was these elders of the clan of Gilead petition Moses. And they also come to the tribal chieftains, because they're concerned, of course, that if these daughters go ahead and marry men from other tribes, they're going to take this stuff with them, and it's going to become property of the other tribes, and it's going to be lost to them. And so the narrative continues by saying that God is once again consulted by Moses, and he gives a response that, they're unrestricted in who they can marry, as long as it's someone from the clan of Gilead. So, you can marry anybody you want to, but he's got to be in this particular neighborhood or in this particular family grouping. So was that as radical as it might have been, or it could have been? Probably not. Up until that time, at least what it sounds like from what we can figure out from the Torah portion is that that women did not inherit, period. That if their father died, their brothers got it, or if there were no brothers, their uncles got it. And with Zelophehad's daughters, no matter which of the decisions it was, they were still permitted to inherit. They just had to find a guy to marry in the tribe. And hopefully they were able to do that. So not only does it talk about inheritance, but it also makes who one married seem to be a little more about having a choice and not necessarily being arranged, because it sounds as if the daughters had some input into who they could marry. And that's also so interesting about these particular narratives. So the biblical the biblical idea. Actually, what I want to do is introduce these two very interesting words. One of which is endogamous, and the other is exogamous. So en meaning within and exo meaning without. And we have this conflict between the interpretation, or is there a prohibition of heiresses to commit exogamy, which is marrying somebody outside of the tribe. And that was actually repealed by the classical rabbis. They, in their discussions, they said, no, they can marry whoever they want. It only applied to that period during the time when the Israelites were in Canaan, and the lands were being divided up between the 12 tribes. It only applied then because of the territories and the way the territories, whether they were contiguous or not. If one tribe is here and one tribe is here, and a woman from here marries a tribe from here, but still owns something over here, how is that? How does that make sense? So all of these things were brought into consideration, and in all forms of Judaism, following the oral law, which is the not the written law of the Torah, the Ten Commandments, but all of the law that has been created and interpreted and written down since that time. Women are allowed to marry whomever they wish, including exogamously. That's a hard word. Exogamously, meaning outside of their tribe, whether they have an inheritance or not. So it doesn't just apply to Zelophehad's daughters, or wouldn't today, who inherited from their father, but it would also apply to a woman who had no inheritance and just wanted to marry somebody from another tribe. Now that, of course, did not include marrying non-Israelites. And, we still have taboos and prohibitions that are certainly not as strictly enforced nowadays. According to the most recent research, over 50% of all Jewish marriages are now interfaith marriages with one partner who's Jewish and one partner who's not. Little of that has to do with, inheritance laws. It has everything to do with who you fall in love with. So, on that note, I'm going to say goodbye and Shabbat Shalom. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Don't forget on Tuesday morning to tune in for Hi There with Rabbi Leah, Tuesday and Thursday. And coming up in the last week of this month, we have Tisha B'Av. So I'll be doing a little teaching about Tisha B'Av, which many of you call Tisha B'Av. And we will be having a memorial service or a service to honor that solemn day, which is, by the way, only the second full fast day, 25-hour fast day in the Hebrew calendar. We have about 10 half fasts that go from morning until evening, from sunrise to sunset, but there are only 2 fasts that go from sunset to sunset. And that's on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. But we'll talk more about that as the commemoration of that approaches. So, Shabbat Shalom. Have a lovely Shabbos snooze. I hope you all take a shlufi. And I will see you next week. Take care. Shabbat Shalom. Bye-bye.